Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What is the creepiest glitch in the Matrix you've experienced? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
10 years ago, I was returning home from a road trip with two friends. I received a phone call from my parents asking when we would be arriving, and I explained that we were about 25 minutes away. About a minute later, we came around a bend. It was a full moon, and we could see the reflection from a lake below us, and other than that, the road was completely empty. Suddenly, everything went completely dark in the car. No lights from the dash or gauges or headlights on the road. The music also stopped and restarted at the beginning of the CD we were listening to. There was now a vehicle pulled over by police about a quarter-mile in front of us that hadn't been there a split second before, and I assumed I had dozed off for just a second as it was late. I thought it was still quite peculiar though. After about a minute, the driver of the car turned the music all the way down and said, "Did that just happen to anyone else?" The other passenger in the back seat sat forward abruptly and exclaimed, "I thought I just fell asleep." We then realized that the clock in the car was reading an hour later than it had just a minute before. To keep ourselves from freaking out, we decided that the car had possibly had a momentary electrical failure and reset the clock to an odd time, turned off all the dash lights, headlights, and gauges, and restarted the CD player. But when we arrived home 25 minutes later, we were 1 hour late. I'm missing an hour of my life, and to this day, have no idea how it happened. When I was a teenager, I had two really intense dreams one night. The first one was about an online friend of mine calling me to say she'd broken up with her boyfriend, and I sang a few lines of Seal's "Don't Cry" to her over the phone. The second dream was finding a real-life friend's dead body floating in her bathtub. I didn't think anything of it up until I logged online that evening and the online friend came online to tell me her boyfriend broke up with her. I immediately asked if I could call her and she said no. I remember thinking that it meant something like I could change it. Not long after my phone rang and it was real-life friend from the dream calling me. I was completely freaked at this point, but talking to her normally. She was just talking about school and shit, up until I realized I heard a splash in the background. I asked her, "Are you in the tub?" And when she said yes, I felt like my heart had stopped. I asked her, "What did you do?" She didn't answer me right away, and then after a very long pause, she told me she'd taken an entire bottle of pills and chased them with mushrooms and vodka. She'd gotten scared waiting for it to hit her, so she called me so she'd hear someone's voice. I hung up and called 911. By the time they got there, she was unconscious, but alive. Today she's a mom to a beautiful little girl, and she's okay.
Lucid precog deja vu? Pretty cool.
I have a sleep tracking app on my phone that has a setting for lucid dreaming. It will start saying, "You are dreaming," repeatedly in a woman's voice with a bit of an echo. I was at work one day when I started hearing the voice randomly every few minutes or so. I checked my phone, and as soon as the screen turned, I woke in my bed and the sun was rising. A bit freaked out, I went to take a shower. Then on my way to work, I started to hear the voice again through the radio. When I turned my car off, a bit freaked out again, I once more woke up in my bed as the sun was rising. This happened about 3 or 4 more times, all at different times of the day. I didn't trust reality for about a week after that and still refused to use that particular setting on the app. Oh, I have a story. One time, my wife and I were coming back from dinner night out. When I opened the door of the house, she was sitting at the computer working, as I usually find her when I get home. Nothing unusual, except she was entering the house with me. I shrugged it off and carried on. We went to bed and I told her that I saw her sitting at the computer, and she goes dead serious and told me that when I opened the door, she saw herself sitting at the computer working. Creepiest thing I've ever experienced. The fact that our two neighbors' 2-year-old daughter used to point to the TV when it was off and tell us that the person on the screen was making scary faces and that she wanted it to go away didn't help us getting much sleep that night. I was sitting in my car with just my dad and I distinctly heard my sister, who was at home, say, "Are you guys almost home? I'm scared," in a very specific concerned tone of voice. 2 seconds later, my dad's phone rings. Guess who's on the line? My sister. She said, "Are you guys almost home? I'm scared," in the same concerned tone of voice. I was pretty freaked out. Not creepy, but so vivid and distinct that I still think about it years later. I had a subjectively long involved dream where I was a vendor in a fish market I remember getting up early, dressing, doing a whole morning routine, going to get tea, heading out to the docks, buying fish, loading them in a cart, and going to get ice, then haggling for ice, buying some less fresh fish while I was at it, then going to a market to my stall, setting up and selling fish all day. It was so real. I talked to friends, smoked nasty cigarettes, haggled customers, ate lunch, had tea, and just lived through the day. At the end of the day, I cleaned up, counted my cash, paid the stall rent, went home, cooked some of the fish I hadn't sold, sling with some veggies and rice that I'd traded for. I drank more tea, relaxed for a while, then drew a hot bath, soaked and smoked some more cigs, then went to bed. The next morning, I woke up refreshed, ready to go down to the docks to buy a fresh catch, except I was in my house, next to my wife, truck parked outside, and it was Saturday, no work. My wife and I were getting geared up to go skiing in Oregon, and the car was already packed. Weird thing was, in the dream, I was single, and a smoker, I'm not, and the whole long dream had been in fluent Chinese, the effortless kind of fluency that only comes from a lifetime of speaking it. Oh, and I had been Chinese. I'm a big hairy white dude, somewhat fluent in Spanish, and I know a little bit of Russian, but it was just weird. I've never worked in a fish market. I wonder who I was. I wonder what that was. This happened back in college. I was driving home from my cabin in northern Wisconsin through the Indian reservation. There was a man on the side of the road sort of limping along, and I pulled over and asked if he was okay. He said yes, he was fine. He just needed to get home because his wife decided she still loved him. They'd had a fight. I asked the man where home was, and surprisingly it was the same city where I went to college, about 2 hours away. I offered him a ride. He didn't talk much, he was tired. When we got into town, he started giving me directions. "Just down here, it's close," he said. "Take a left at the lights." "Okay," I said. "Right here," he said, pointing. "After the white truck." "Here?" I pulled into the driveway. "Yes." "Shut up," I said. "What?" he asked. He was grinning like he knew what I was going to say next. "I used to live here," I told him. "You don't say." "Yes, upstairs, apartment number 3. "Yeah, that's ours." Now he was smiling ear to ear. "Small world," he said. He thanked me for the ride and got out of my car and walked through the front door of my old apartment building. I know it was just a coincidence, but it was one of the strangest moments of my life.
Did anyone else pick up the maybe you picked up your future self vibe from that story? I thought it was really cool.
I got a call from a police officer telling me if I didn't pay some old fines within a week, he would come arrest me. The total was $267.63. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas, so I was really sweating it. The very next day, I got a check in the mail for $267.63 for overpaid child support throughout the year. Craziest, most unexplainable thing I've ever had happen to me. I was heading home with my dad. We stopped at a drive-thru. I start feeling more and more anxious for no reason, to the point where it makes me lightheaded and sick to my stomach. We have to wait a little bit ahead because they gave us the order wrong. So I sit there feeling like shit, and it suddenly comes to me an urge to call my brother. He was trying to call us. He was in a car accident. No one died. Some got seriously bruised. He was only shaken. I told him to shut up and get as far away from the car as possible. He didn't understand, but followed through, trying to call some of his buddies, and I could hear them calling him a wuss, him giving up and getting far, and then a loud noise, people shouting. After the whole shit was over, he told me what happened. His drunk friend tried to impress some girls in the car, hit the gas, drifted, and hit the bottom of the car on some rocks, completely effing with the engine. They stood near the car, the driver still inside trying to turn the engine back on. The hood burst in flames and the car started to burn fast. The driver managed to get away, but got severely hurt. Some of the guys and girls who stood around were hurt and burned too, but not as bad as the driver. My brother was the only one with light bruises from the whole thing. He told me that when I ordered him to get away from the car, he was in front of it, inches from the hood. I never experienced anything like this before and after, just this once. It's just an effing weird memory. I don't remember what I was thinking. I remember it like watching a movie and seeing myself and everything from an outside angle. It happened in early 2000 when I was working at a juvenile detention center in a small town in Oklahoma as a corrections officer. I was working nights at the time and went to work at 9 p.m. This one night, when I arrived for work, my supervisor looked confused and asked me what I was doing there. I said, "I work tonight." And he said, "But they said you called in a few hours ago saying that you were sick." I was a bit confused and said it must have been someone else, and they got the message wrong. After everyone else showed up for work that night, it was a bit more weird, but we carried on as usual and assigned everyone their places for the night. I went to work in the control room where I usually work. The control room is the center of the prison that has direct control over the cameras, doors, phones, and everything. After I relieved the guard on duty and settled in for the night, I looked at the message that said I called in. It said that I had called at 6:50 and said that I had gotten sick while out cleaning up after the storm. There had been a storm that night before, and it was a bit bad, but not anything that I had to go out to clean up. It was truly weird. The supervisor came into the control about that time. He was also a friend of mine outside work, and we started talking about it and how odd it was. I decided to call my wife at home and tell her about it while he was still sitting there. I picked up the phone and dialed. After 2 rings, a man picked up the phone and with a raspy voice said, "Hello?" I did not know what to say for a few seconds. I looked at the phone to make sure I dialed the right number, and I had. After a few seconds, the person said, "Hello?" again in the same raspy voice. I said, "Hello, who is this?" "This is Taylor, who is this?" the person said. My head started spinning because my name is Taylor too. I said in almost a scream, "Where's Ann?" He said, "Ann's in bed, who is this?" I dropped the phone and told my supervisor to ring me out. I had to get home, and I took off towards the door. I could hear Dave pick up the phone behind me and say, "Hello?" followed soon after by, "What the F?" rather loudly. I ran to my car and drove home faster than what was legal. My mind was racing the entire time. I busted through the door, and my wife was sitting watching TV and was shocked at me being home. I asked her who was there, and she said no one has been here. After a rather long talk with my wife, I went to call the prison to tell them what was going on, but the phone was dead. I went back to work, and when I came in, Dave was acting weird and asked me, "How the hell are you doing this?" He told me that when I left, he picked up the phone and the person on the other end sounded like me. He kind of freaked out and hung up the phone. A minute later, as he could see my car leaving the parking lot, I had called back from home and asked what the F was going on. He said that I was a bit irate and said I was sick and did not feel like playing these games and was telling him to stop prank calling me and hung up. After convincing him I had no idea what was going on, we went back to work. Later, I found out that the phone line for my area had been knocked down the night before by the storm. This is absolutely the strangest thing that has ever happened to me.
If you made this movie, I would watch it right now. Pretty intriguing.
Probably not exactly what OP means, but having a false awakening was interesting, where you wake up, get the day rolling, etc., but you're actually still dreaming. Only had it happen once. Got paranoid for the entire day after that. This happened when I was 11. I still remember it like it was yesterday. My grandfather was getting old and had been in and out of the hospital a few times that year. At that moment, he had been in the hospital for probably 2 days. We had gone into the hospital to visit him, where I gave him a big hug and told him I loved him and would see him tomorrow. That night I went to bed and had the most beautiful dream. My grandpa came into my room and sat in the rocking chair in the corner. He invited me into his lap and told me he was going away for a while and that someday he would see me again. I shouldn't worry because everything was okay and he wasn't in any pain. I smiled at him and gave him a big hug and told him I understood. I then looked over at my brother sleeping in the bunk below me and asked my grandpa if we should wake him and tell him. When I turned back around to get a response from my grandpa, he was gone. I ran to the window to look out onto the front yard. There he was, waving at me. He whispered, "Go tell your mom and dad exactly what I told you." I looked back at the door to my room and then back at the front yard and he was gone. I immediately woke up, ran to my parents' room and turned on the light. I told them exactly what Grandpa had told me. They told me it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I told them again exactly what Grandpa told me. Again, frustrated it was 2 a.m., told me to go to bed and we would talk about it in the morning. Just then the phone rang. It was the hospital. My mother started sobbing. Grandpa had passed. At that moment, she just sat there with my father staring at me. I still remember their faces. They both looked at each other, then me, then each other, and finally smiled and stopped crying. They gave me a big hug and told me they loved me and to go back to bed. They ended up going to the hospital that night and my aunt came over to watch us. But we've never talked about that night since. In fact, I don't think I've ever written about it, which explains the tears rolling down my cheeks right now. Wow, that was liberating. And I'm glad other people have had these types of things happen. Thanks for sharing. During a spinal tap procedure, I was put under. While under the anesthetics, I had what I can only explain as an out-of-body experience, seeing as how my viewpoint was from above my body looking down on the procedure. I watched the whole thing and saw that the doctor knocked my Game Boy off the tabletop while walking by, batteries ejecting from the fall. One fell in sight and he picked it up, but the other was next to the front left wheel under the bed out of his view, but not mine. I woke up groggy and told him where my other battery was, and he was shocked where he found it there. To this day, it still weirds me out. I used to live in North Carolina a few years ago and still regularly go back to visit friends. While I was there, my friends and I, who are now in college or graduated, ran into somebody who we had known, although I didn't know her very well, back in high school. A few days later, I flew back home to Texas. The next day, I went to the grocery store and was walking down the aisle when I see a girl that looks exactly the same. I did the biggest double take I've ever done. Being 1,400 miles away from the city where I knew the girl lived, it seemed absolutely impossible. As it turns out, after I called my friend about it, the girl I had been talking to in North Carolina had an identical twin in Texas who just happens to live in the same city as me. For a couple hours, I thought I was crazy though. You should talk to her. When I was like 10 or 11, was going to the beach with my aunt and her friends. There were 2 cars of us. To get there, we had to go through a very large industrial area. We didn't know the direction, so our car was following the other. Suddenly, they did an unexpected turn, and so our driver had to take a sharp bend. In that moment, we heard a very clear, loud voice inside the car saying, laughing, "Sharp bend, The driver immediately hit the brakes. We looked at each other puzzled. We all recognized it as a voice not belonging to any of us. In the very same time, we noticed that the other car had stopped as well. The other driver got out of the car with a scared face and shouted to us, Did you just hear that as well?" They heard the very same thing inside their car. The area around was fully deserted. As I type this, I'm already feeling deja vu. I've always wanted to share this part of my life with someone, but have never been able to. So, I'll just tell a bunch of people on the internet. One day I was walking to work and all of a sudden had an urge to walk to a different path than usual. I work downtown in a big city. It was a strange spur-of-the-moment urge to walk a different way that changed my life forever. I turned into an alley I had never seen before. As I remember it, I made it about 15 feet or so when an actual glitch happened. Everything in my mind scrambled. I felt like I didn't have a body anymore, just that I was a semi-conscious entity floating through some weird dimension. All of a sudden, in the array of different colors and shapes, a vision came to me. It was a bunch of strange-looking people that, in my mind, resembled businessmen in suits. They looked startled and panicked that I could see them. One of the people made a quick movement and everything turned to black. When I regained normality, I was on a completely different street. It was the same street that I always used to walk to work. I felt sick and severely disturbed or depressed. I've never done any hard drugs, never experienced any hallucinations, never have had anything like this happen to me. The weird thing is, when the glitch was correcting itself and I could see those people watching me like a caged animal, I had the feeling that I knew I was being controlled. It still bothers me very much to this day. TLDR, had a moment of spontaneity, caused a real-life glitch. Life has seemed different ever since.